Hey everybody, this is Professor D'Angelo, and we're here for another installation of our early American history class. This is the segment on the early American Republic. This is Jefferson and Madison as President of the United States. And we'll be looking at various aspects of how the nation handled itself in the period after the Federalists left office in 1801. So the United States in 1800 was continuing to expand in the decades after the Revolution. The particularly largest growth as far as expansion was concerned was what we would refer to as the Trans-Appalachian region. So this is the area between the western boundary of the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. And most Americans continued to work as farmers. About 90% of America was still rural. And there were an increasing number of people who were beginning to make their livings in emerging markets such as textiles, banking, and construction. And although Adams was the first president to live in Washington, D.C., what was referred to then as the Executive Mansion, it's now known as the White House. Jefferson was the first president to be inaugurated in the new capital city. At the time, Washington, D.C. wasn't even complete, but Congress and the Supreme Court had followed the president there nonetheless. Jefferson's election was the first to be a peaceful transition between two different factions or parties. This is something that had never really been seen before. Usually when factions take over from another, there's some sort of bloodletting that surrounds it, and this didn't happen. I should note that Western expansion does get stalled because of British intrusions, which we'll talk about in a minute as far as causes for the war. The economic growth that was happening in the United States was an increasingly integrated market economy. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the next chapter. But essentially what's happening is people are moving away from what I would refer to as subsistence living. And this is where you're basically growing your own food and feeding your family, and then surplus you were using to barter or to sell in order to get other things that you needed. And what's going to happen is people are going to, beginning in this time period, are going to increasingly sell their labor and obtain capital from which they buy their needed materials. And this type of a system was very dependent on global trade. And in the period right after the Revolution, this was made difficult because we were no longer part of the British International Trading Network. So in the late 1700s, American merchants, mostly New Englanders, had to try to find other markets. And so many had sailed all the way around South America to China and other parts of the East Indies. And, some of those markets were pretty lucrative. But the bulk of our products for sale were going to be agricultural in nature, and they required access to European markets, and this is going to also cause some problems for the United States in the future. So Washington, D.C. itself was the new federal city, as I just stated, and Jefferson's inauguration is the first one to take place there. And it's an interesting one because John Adams was so embittered from the election process. The story that I've heard is that after the elections, Jefferson basically goes to Adams to, I don't know if you would say mend fences or to try to create a kind of sense of bipartisanship or something. Jefferson makes an attempt to smooth over things, and Adams is just completely not going to have it. Jefferson, I think, almost immediately after being elected, realized just how much baloney was going to have to go into being president of the United States. And Jefferson had run for president on this very staunch anti-federalist position, which was that, Washington needed to be smaller and on a tighter budget and all these other things that I'll talk about in a moment. And right after his inauguration, the sort of like job seekers and office people start to swarm him, and he, I think, really tries to go to Adams for advice, and Adams just like, what are you talking to me for? So Jefferson comes to Washington on this platform of republicanism. We always have to be careful here because people have a tendency to see republicanism and they think of a party, the Republican Party. And that's not what we're talking about here. Republicanism is the idea that a government can succeed without a monarch, that the people are sovereign, and that they will choose representatives who will go and draft legislation on their behalf and bring order out of chaos through cooperation and compromise. And so Jefferson believed in this, and he believed in it in a spirit of what I'm going to call confederalism. He believed strongly in the power of states. He was very, I would say, almost nationalistic about his state of Virginia, and he, wanted to appeal to what he thought was the common man, which for him was the American farmer. So, there's all these folk tales about Jefferson, about how you could see the President of the United States walking around town in Georgetown and other places, doing his own shopping for food, or simply going for a horseback ride. He would answer the door at the White House himself. He kind of did what Benjamin Franklin used to do. He used to play up this sort of people's president idea. Benjamin Franklin, when he was in France, he liked to walk around in fur cap and homespun clothes to make it look like he was this poor country guy. But, in reality, he very much wasn't. Jefferson would answer the White House door in his robe and slippers, kind of like, oh, I'm just, casually doing my president thing or whatever. But he really believed that he was going to usher in what he called the Revolution of 1800, which was to revive the spirit of 76 and get Americans excited about freedom and republicanism and, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as it were. So in office, however, Jefferson has to deal with some very serious problems. First was the repeal of the Judiciary Act. What had happened is during the lame duck period, the Federalists still had control of the Congress and the White House. And so what they did is they had passed a new Judiciary Act creating additional federal judgeships, which Adams, the outgoing president, promptly filled with Federalists, some of whom were gentlemen who had lost the election for 1800 for seats in the House and Senate. And so these are referred to as the Midnight Judges. And they're called that because Adams was literally signing them until the final days of his time in office. And what happens is that the Republicans take control of both houses and essentially take it upon themselves to kind of wreak havoc, as it were. And there was an attempt to actually impeach one of the justices on the Supreme Court, Samuel Chase, excuse me. And this becomes a rather contentious thing, but it establishes a precedent in American jurisprudence, I guess. Chase was a partisan. He was very Federalist and loved to kind of belittle petitioners from an anti-federalist position. He was often rude. And so when they got their majorities in both houses, Republicans decided that they were going to get rid of him. But this fails. And it fails on really two counts. One substantive and one other sort of spirit-based, if you will. The substantive was there just wasn't anything there. There weren't any real crimes or misdemeanors that justified removing him from office. And the second is that in this very early period, people still felt uncomfortable tampering with the independence of the judiciary. And the failure to impeach Chase basically established this idea or spirit, however you want to put it, that that justices are to be as independent as possible from the other branches, and the whole thing collapses. But what the Republicans bring to the court system, and this is going to be after the fact, is that once judgeships do become available, they will start to fill them with judges who follow the anti-federalist philosophy, which meant that they were going to exercise something called judicial restraint. And this is a concept that basically says that the Constitution must be interpreted literally, and that the Constitution says some things and it doesn't say other things. And it was important for a judge to know the difference between the two. That the Constitution was in fact a living contract that stays the same today, tomorrow, and forever. And this is a form of interpretation that still exists in the court. So what happens is that one of the judicial appointments under Adams goes to a gentleman named Marbury. And William Marbury, who had been appointed by Adams, failed to receive his letter. So when Secretary of State James Madison, who served under Jefferson, took up his job, he refused to give the commission to Marbury. Basically what this was is an individual would receive a letter of appointment signed by the president. They would then go to Washington, and at the time the Secretary of State was not just a foreign policy person. They actually were the sort of human resources director for the entire government. And so you would go to the Secretary of State and submit your letter, and then they would give you what's referred to as a commission. It's just a written document telling me what post you're going to have at what salary and where it was going to be. And so now when Marbury came in with a letter signed by Adams, Madison refused to honor that commission, and Marbury sued Madison for what's referred to as a writ of mandamus. He wanted the court to force the hand of Madison to give him his appointment. And so the case establishes something called judicial review, and this is the idea that that only the U.S. Supreme Court has final say on the constitutionality of law. And this is an interesting case because Marbury's position was that the court should issue the writ because he received a commission by a duly elected and sitting president of the United States. Madison's position, arguing for Thomas Jefferson, the president, was that the Supreme Court and the courts in general had no jurisdiction in this case because of separation of powers. So Madison was arguing that the president of the United States was exercising his duly obtained powers to appoint judges, and therefore there was no role for the judicial branch. It was, in a sense, saying, mind your own business. So what happens is that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who was John Marshall, who also happened to be Jefferson's cousin, but an Adams appointee. So the seat of Chief Justice had become available in the lame duck period, and Adams appointed John Marshall. And, Marshall basically told Marbury that he wasn't in his position to do it because he found a flaw in the Judiciary Act of 1789, or 1801, and therefore he couldn't honor the mandamus. But he also made a point of saying, well, if Jefferson was a gentleman, he'd honor the commission, basically a slam against his own cousin. But the argument here, though, is that Jefferson won the case but lost the argument, because by ruling in the case, Marshall was basically telling Jefferson that he was wrong, that he did have jurisdiction in this case. It's called judicial review, and that the Supreme Court and the federal courts, period, had the power to review the actions of presidents, of Congress, of everyone else. And what happens from the Marbury case is there's a series of other cases that we'll talk about later where the court expands this into other realms. Here it was the Supreme Court reviewing not just congressional statute, but executive action. There are going to be cases under the Marshall Court where the court expands judicial review over state legislatures, over state courts, and over state executive action. So this now gets expanded in all sorts of other realms. And this is a combination of the assumptions of judicial power as explained in Article 78 of the Federalist Papers by Hamilton, and by a rather bold interpretation, I guess, of the Supremacy Clause. So in Jefferson's economic policies, Jefferson ended up being not as radical as everybody thought he was going to be. He went into office basically promising to tear the government down and to basically dispel or disperse power back to the states. And in reality, he kind of kept a lot of Federalist policies in place and didn't really decentralize power. Basically, we get this interesting dilemma, right? And it was the first national government to reduce its own power in size. So Jefferson shrunk the number of embassies that we had. He shrunk the number of actual officers that were in the government, and he brings on board Secretary of Treasury Albert Gallatin, who was an immigrant from Switzerland, a French-Swiss immigrant. And he's going to bring in what's often referred to as the austerity budgets. And so Jefferson believed that the debt that was incurred in order for Hamilton's plan to go forward was an anathema to the idea of an independent government or an independent country. And so Jefferson wanted it paid off. So he put the government on a very strict budget. But as you can see in the picture up here, other countries had other things in mind. And in this specific case, this is what was referred to as the Barbary Wars. So in the early 1800s, American ships started to be harassed by basically pirates coming from the Barbary coast of Northwest Africa. These were, very fierce pirates, if you will. And the reality was that American ships were no longer sailing the British flag. The British Navy had a combination intimidation bribery scheme that they used on pirates. They would go in and basically capture a couple of pirate ships and be rather harsh with them. And then they would essentially pay others bribes to just not harass ships with the British flag. Well, the Americans no longer had the British flag. And so in the late 1700s, early 1800s, American ships started to be harassed and captured and held for ransom and all the rest of it. And this was a problem that Jefferson felt that he could probably ignore. And in fact, the Navy that was built during the Quasi-War was basically left to go to mothball. And he established what was referred to as a Coast Guard, or what his critics called the Mosquito Navy, because it was so small. And so what happens is an American naval ship is captured by the Pasha of Tripoli in present-day Libya, and the U.S. Embassy is attacked there. Sound familiar? But anyway, U.S. Marines are captured and taken prisoner, and Jefferson in 1805 is forced to do something about it. So he sends the U.S. Navy there under a guy named Captain Decatur, and they do this full-on amphibious assault of the bay there, and free our sailors and set fire to the town. And the Pasha of Tripoli is forced to concede, and it's our first sort of great naval victory, if you will. That's why the Marines talk about from the shores of Tripoli in their song. When there's Somali pirate issues in the 1990s, the U.S. is going to send the Navy out to take care of that, and one of the ships they send is the USS Decatur. Sort of poignant. Now, the next thing that comes along that challenges Jefferson's austerity budget is the Louisiana Purchase. Now, this has been a problem from the beginning. Actually, it precedes the Barbary Wars. Napoleon had possession of the Louisiana Purchase, and he was considering selling parts of that land. Now, one of Napoleon's dreams, if you were, it was to regain French imperial designs in the Western Hemisphere. So if you remember from our previous chapters, France had given Louisiana to Spain prior to the French Revolution. And that's because the Spanish king was a Bourbon and the French king was a Bourbon. Well, in the French Revolution, the Bourbon family was removed. When Napoleon comes to power in France, one of the things that he feared, or that he allowed the people to fear, if you will, was this idea that the Spanish were somehow going to figure out a way to put the Bourbons back on the throne of France. And so the Spanish and the French engage in this kind of back and forth, and until the Spanish agree to give Louisiana back to France. And this is in 1801. Now, Jefferson is a Francophile. He is absolutely 100% in love with France. He believes in the French Revolution. But he knew that Napoleon was bombastic and militaristic, and his fear was that if you look on this map that's here, you'll notice that the border of the northern border of the Louisiana Territory is rather nebulous in its placement. And if you see, then Canada is up there, and that's British. So Jefferson said it didn't take too much to look at the map and realize that whenever the British and the French have territorial disputes between each other, they tend to go to war. And for the Americans who had basically negotiated a treaty with Spain to reopen up the Mississippi and the port of New Orleans through very difficult negotiations in the Pinckney Treaty, Jefferson was afraid that if the French were to go to war with Britain, they would close off the Mississippi and New Orleans, and the Americans would be forced to align themselves with Britain, which, to Jefferson would be like telling him to drink poison. So Jefferson wanted to avoid that. And he's going to engage in a series of decisions that he's going to refer to as peaceful coercion. And so what he does is he sends Robert Livingston to France and telling him to offer about $10 million for the port of New Orleans and the western shore of the Mississippi all the way to its source. And what happens essentially is the French are having a problem, or have had a problem, I should say, with the colony of Haiti. There had been a complete takeover of that French colony by slaves, and virtually every single white French citizen there was slaughtered. The French Napoleon tries to send troops to retake it, and it fails. And Napoleon, for whatever reason, thinks that this is not the time for him to be tinkering in the New World. He would rather put his focus on Britain and Austria and Russia. And so what he does is he comes to the American delegate and offers the entire territory for $15 million. And my understanding is that Livingston just says yes without any, qualms, but also without any consultation with Washington. So Jefferson finds out after the fact, hey, I made this commitment. And this creates a dilemma. Because as an anti-federalist, Jefferson believed that the Constitution had to be interpreted literally. And so in Article 1, Section 8 is a verbatim list of the powers of the federal government. The 10th Amendment says anything not listed there is a power of the states. Well, unfortunately for Jefferson, there was nothing in Article 1, Section 8 that gave a president the power to purchase land on behalf of the country. It certainly didn't give him the power to do it without congressional approval. And this creates a huge dilemma. Federalists are going to be very quick to point out the hypocrisy, because it was hypocrisy. And the president is pretty much left into the lurch. And what happens is this significant land increase is very popular among the people. And Jefferson does what every true blue constitutionalist would never do. He ignores the Constitution. He basically presents his arguments to the American people in a way that he knew that they would respond. And that was basically, look at all of this massive land that's going to be available to all of us. And it's going to allow us to all be virtuous farmers, and the expansion of the Republican experiment into greater spaces of North America. And the American people, of course, are all over it. And the Federalists are just apoplectic, but at the same time, they appreciate the value of that land also. But many people didn't even realize just how much land it was until the president sends out Meriwether Lewis and William Clark in what we now refer to as the Great Lewis and Clark Expedition. These two men and their expedition party basically go on a 2-year walk, which, no thank you. But anyway, he does this really to prove the value of this land. But we have to remember, the president of the United States, who was on an austerity budget because he believed that the debt had to be paid off because it was in a sense immoral to take on this much debt, basically takes on $15 million more debt and extends the period necessary to pay down the debt significantly. And this troubles Jefferson, but he gets over it. His Secretary of State, Madison, however, who was a Federalist at one point, did not have a problem with this. And so Jefferson is just basically allowed to go forward. And it was an incredibly popular position to take in the United States. So Lewis and Clark go out there, and the picture that you see there is a statue and is a tribute to Sacagawea, and it's basically a tribute to her contribution to saving the expedition, quite literally saving what was known as the Corps of Discovery, and they are going to basically chart in their diaries and other observations plant life, right? The flora and fauna and the Indian tribes and other types of observations that are made in terms of going out west and what was there and what possibilities there might be. Another explorer, Zebulon Pike, will make observations of that area, calling it the Great American Desert. At the time, it was all plains. There was virtually no trees at all anywhere in that area that you see of Louisiana, and therefore believed that there was absolutely no reason for white human inhabitation or habitation of the area. And so their journals, Lewis and Clark's journals, will be used by early pioneers when they do finally make that trek from St. Louis out west. So now the election of 1800 had put Jefferson as president and Aaron Burr of New York as the vice president. And so the Federalists were vehemently opposed to Jefferson, but they had also pushed out John Adams and the sort of, let's just call them a moderate faction. And now Hamilton was firmly in control of that. Now, what actually did happen, by the way, is that Jefferson and Burr were tied in 1800. And so the election for president had to go to the House of Representatives. And so Jefferson actually had blamed Burr for the closeness of the election, as they were both from the same party. So in 1804, Burr was not given the opportunity to run for re-election with Jefferson. The 12th Amendment had been passed, and the ballot was now split. So before, everybody ran for president. First place went to the president, and second place to the vice president. And in 1804, the electors would now vote twice. They would cast a ballot for president and cast a ballot for vice president, which is what we have today. And therefore, people began to run on what are called tickets. Jefferson boots Burr out and replaces him with Clinton. And so to make matters worse, Burr had found out that Hamilton had spread, I would actually say, kind of true stories about him and his personality and his character. And he basically has enough, and he challenges Hamilton to a duel in which Hamilton is killed. So Burr, who was still technically the vice president of the United States, is a fugitive of the law, wanted for murder, and which makes for some very interesting national politics. That's why when people say to me today that, you know, American politics are so bad, I just think, wow, you know, there's no way it's as negative as it was in 1801 to 1805. It's really pretty incredible. But in all fairness, Jefferson did face divisions within his own party, right? So Jefferson's second term proves to be a lot more difficult. That tends to be a trend all the way through American history. Presidents seem to feel that their second terms are going to be sort of easier and purposeful and have all kinds of deep meaning. In reality, they're just really kind of a mess. So as I stated, that should say the 12th Amendment, but obviously the 12th Amendment has huge implications for Jefferson because he got to run solely for president and didn't have to worry about competition with his own party. But Jefferson's second term, I think, is where Jefferson really starts to understand the difference between ideology and governing. And this is a problem that all presidents have faced. And that is the idea that somehow, you can just do everything the way you want to do it, and there's never going to be any challenge to it, and you're just always going to have, things done your way. And then, you get into office and you find out that, guess what? You don't get everything your way just because you're the president, and the ideology that you brought in there gets faced with reality real quick. And, this becomes difficult for Jefferson. He lives in ideals. His entire life was about philosophy and reason and thinking and dreaming of these, great ideas about government, and not all of it comes into being. And, it's a difficult thing for him. Even within his own party, there are problems. And that's because of these compromises. I mean, Jefferson's role in the Louisiana Purchase, his dealings in the Barbary Pirates, I mean, all of these different things showed Jefferson being just a little bit on the Federalist side. And this was because Jefferson had to govern. It's not necessarily because he was technically a hypocrite. It's just that, he just realized that he liked using power just like anybody else. And that unfortunately ran against traditional Republican ideals as articulated by the Anti-Federalists in the Anti-Federalist Papers and the formation of the Republican Party. John Randolph was a congressman from Virginia, also related to Jefferson. And Randolph led an opposition against Jefferson from within the ranks. They were called the Old Republicans, or what Jefferson referred to as the tertium quid, or third something. And they really didn't like Jefferson stretching the meaning of the Constitution in order to give himself powers that he really didn't have. And this opposition was perpetual and constant against the president. Then the former vice president, Aaron Burr, gets caught up in a conspiracy involving the Louisiana Territory. And this becomes kind of bizarre. So you have a man who was wanted for murder, who now gets suspected of having conspired to break off a piece of American territory to create another country with him as the president. This conspiracy becomes more bizarre, and he's captured and brought to trial in front of John Marshall. Now, it's interesting because John Marshall was a friend of Alexander Hamilton, who Burr had killed. And this was, in many ways, a perfect opportunity for Federalists to get revenge. But I guess to his credit, Marshall refuses to move forward. He says that the testimony did not basically fulfill the stipulation for treason. There needed to be two eyewitnesses. And one of the witnesses was a Captain Wilkinson, who was essentially part of the conspiracy, who turns coat and tries to become a witness against the conspiracy. And basically, he's free to go. And this conspiracy pulls a shadow over Jefferson quite a bit, because it tore the party up. It brought shadow on him personally. I mean, the whole thing was rather a mess. And so co-opting some Federalist ideas into his own administration may have made him more broadly appealing to the American people, but in Washington, D.C. and within his own party, it created division and a lot of resentment. And the only thing that Jefferson really gets to do in the second term that reaffirmed some of his idealism was the ending of the slave trade in 1808. Now, this was a stipulation that was in the Constitution itself, in some ways part of the Three-Fifths Compromise, that the United States would stop importing slaves after 1808. Jefferson, along with a lot of other people, had believed that slavery was a dying institution. Jefferson and Madison and many of the founding fathers who were in fact slave owners, and for some bizarre, naive reason that I could only describe as latent racism, they believed that somehow life was going to end slavery, sort of saving them the burden of having to sort of give it up. And so the idea was, if you cut off the supply of slaves, you could somehow allow for its gradual elimination. And so Jefferson takes great pride in this, but of course this act, while on the surface seemingly benevolent, was in fact diabolical, because after the importation of slaves was banned in 1808, each of the slaves became more valuable in terms of actual dollar amount to the slave owner, and slave owners began to quite literally breed slaves, and making an already diabolical practice just a loathsome and an abomination, in my opinion. But anyhow, so for Jefferson, the real crossroads comes when war breaks out in Europe. So the French Revolution, because it was promoting the idea of ridding a government of monarchy, drew the ire of all of the royal families of the surrounding countries in Europe. It's no surprise. And just a realist approach to international relations will tell you that whenever one power seems to be a threat, the others tend to rally together and align themselves to balance that power out. And this is kind of no surprise or difference here. However, for the United States, both Britain and France had issued rulings or laws, if you will, basically trying to isolate each other from being supplied. So the British tried to blockade France, and the French tried to essentially blockade Britain. The British blockade was more successful, I would argue. However, this caused problems for the United States, because we, as neutrals, wanted to remain outside of this argument and instead continue to engage in our trade relationships with both sides. And this was not going to be accepted by either one. So both sides wanted the United States to trade only with them. Because the United States was neutral, it was against international law. But because we really didn't have a navy to do anything about it, Jefferson's austerity budget, this caused an incredible amount of problems for us. Now, from the worst offender was Britain. And Napoleon was definitely okay with harassing American shipping. But the British had an added practice that both terrified and angered Americans. And it's referred to as impressment. So both Britain and France would stop American products from getting to the other side. However, the British, because they spoke English and we spoke English, would not only stop our ships and take our cargo, but started to take our sailors, in practice called impressment, that basically claimed that sailors on American ships were in fact AWOL British sailors who were now going to be forced to serve in the British Navy. Well, there were in fact a lot of AWOL British sailors who had gone to the American Navy. The American Navy was much less punitive by miles and miles and miles. And many found the life on American Navy ships better than that on the British Navy, which I don't, anyhow. But this practice was vilified all across the United States. And so in 1807, the USS Chesapeake, sailing, we believe, still in American waters, was actually rammed by the HMS Leopard, or what we would say Leopard. The British say Leopard, but was attacked and rendered unnavigable by the British ship, and American sailors were removed. So this heightened the tension, and so Americans wanted to basically address this issue. And so we get what's called the Embargo Act. Now, this is, again, part of this peaceful coercion. Jefferson essentially believed that neither Britain nor France could sustain their military endeavors without the raw materials and food coming out of the United States. That, in fact, American timber, American tar, American sails and jute and all these other products were in fact feeding the British and French navies, and that without us they couldn't do what they were going to do. Now, this backfires. Basically, it said that American ships would no longer trade with the outside world, but would rather engage only in interstate trade. So American ships were ordered to stay at port. This caused a nationwide economic slowdown. But in New England, which was predominantly Federalist, it brought the economy to near collapse. And for Federalists, they did not see this as some sort of patriotic act, but rather as a rather intentional partisan slight against them by the president. So Jefferson, in the midst of all of this heartache, and has to, in a sense, back down. And during his lame duck session, issues the Non-Intercourse Act, which is 1809. Now, this isn't an abstinence law, but rather it was basically saying the United States would engage in commerce, but not with belligerence, which is an interesting parsing of words. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that both Britain and France now have a reason to go after American shipping and basically brand it contraband. So in 1808, Jefferson's Secretary of State, Madison, is able to succeed him to the presidency. Now, this was a rather easy election. His administration, however, is going to be characterized by tensions with Britain and France and by what's going to be called the War of 1812. But also, Madison starts this trend, I guess. And I've spoken about this before. But Madison, as Jefferson's Secretary of State, was in many ways the most qualified person to take the job. As I had stated earlier, secretaries of state didn't just handle foreign policy. They were also the human resources director of the entire United States government. They were the secretary of the state. And so these gentlemen had an unbelievably high level of knowledge about the inner workings of the government, period, and understood the international relations aspect of being a sovereign state, and this made them particularly qualified to do these jobs. But what happens is it establishes this myth, if you will, that all secretaries of state are future presidents. And so it sort of makes that job incredibly sought after and very prized, but it also will lend itself to controversy, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. So the president, Madison, now comes to power, and there is a very large clamor for war. Remember, this has all been heating up for several years prior to him coming to office. He is aware of it, of course, because he was the Secretary of State. But what happens is in the midterm elections of 1810, a number of very young Republicans get elected in both the South and in the emerging new Western states. And they're referred to as the War Hawks, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit more. But they are going to come to office in 1811, which should give you sort of an idea of how logical these dates are, right? Why the War of 1812 and not the War of 1813 or 1810 or 1809, right? There are reasons for that, and the election of the War Hawks is one of them. And so it also brings to power three men who are going to be referred to as the Immortal Trio. The War Hawks will be led by Henry Clay, who is a young congressman from Kentucky, a new state from the 1790s, and then from South Carolina will be John C. Calhoun. A Federalist will also come to power, first as a congressman from New Hampshire, but then eventually he'll move and become a senator from Massachusetts. And this is Daniel Webster, who will be known as the great orator of the Senate. And what happens is their electoral numbers in the House are going to make them very formidable group, and they're going to spur this very pro-war fervor against Britain, something Republicans had held on to since the Revolution. And Madison, who's quite literally a small man, 5'4" and very slight, and a barely audible person, just did not have the sort of force of presence to sort of rein in this group. Madison's going to be tricked into repealing the Embargo Act, and the whole thing is really quite simply going to get out of his control. So, for the causes of the war, we have to look at the several factors. First, the British had kept troops in the Northwest Territory even after Jay's Treaty, where the United States basically promised that they would try to get these debts paid. The British refused to evacuate territory. They were also using their posts there to incite Indians to attack American settlers. There is the impressment of U.S. sailors that I talked about, and the disruption of U.S. trade networks. And so these things combined really demonstrated a major constriction on American life as an independent nation. And that's why some people call the War of 1812 the Second War of Independence. So the Native Americans are a major factor in this. The Indians had formed what I'm going to call an alliance with the British. I don't know that it was necessarily formal, but the British had been inciting Indians for a long time, and Indians believed, rightly or wrongly, that should the British be able to defeat the Americans, that they, the Indians, would regain their so-called Indian Reserve, which is essentially the territory between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes to the Floridas. And so the Indians tried to learn from previous Indian mistakes, and that was instead of being divided amongst themselves, that they would unify. And this is a drawing, a depiction of the Shawnee Indian leader Tecumseh. And Tecumseh had been a part of something that we'll sort of touch on a little bit later. There was a movement in this time period called the Second Great Awakening, and it had affected all parts of the United States. And Indians were also affected by this religious movement, but it actually bifurcates. Some Indians will embrace Christianity and embark on a path of westernization. And there will be a number of Indians that we'll talk about later called the Five Civilized Tribes. And they will evolve out of this Christianization of Indian societies and nations. The Shawnee, however, under Tecumseh, went in a different direction. And this was a spiritual revival that revived the traditional native spiritualism that had existed before Europeans arrived. And it involved the rejection of alcohol and the rejection of Western living. And they set up a village for people to go to, which was named after his brother, the prophet. And they basically made it a confederation. So he invited multiple tribes, including the Miami and others in the Great Lakes area, to join together to resist American incursion into what is now the Midwest, and formed an alliance with the British. Now, this was a rather formidable one, and Tecumseh and his brother, the prophet, and the Shawnee do terrorize the area. I mean, white people in the area and in the South will remember the name Tecumseh for a very long time. In the Civil War, when the General William Tecumseh Sherman comes marching into town, the name means something to people. And so the Shawnee are going to be a formidable opponent for the Americans. And so what happens is during the war, we're going to get what's called the Battle of Tippecanoe. And this is William Henry Harrison, who will become a war hero because of this very battle. Tecumseh's brother is captured, I believe killed, and the sort of dreamed of confederation that Tecumseh had hoped to create breaks apart. And this is devastating, right? So but it is going to be followed up, right? So the Warhawks now have complete control of what's going on. The narrative is in their hands. They come up with the slogan, "Free Soil and Sailors' Rights." Free soil referring to British troops on American soil. Sailor rights dealing with the acts of impressment that were being done against American sailors. And the nation was completely enthralled with the idea of teaching the British a lesson. And so what happened, of course, was that the president's own actions brought about disaster. So in 1811, the Bank of the United States, which had been created by Hamilton during the Washington administration, expired. It had a 20-year charter. So in 1811, there had to be a vote in the Congress to renew the charter. Well, if you can recall from the previous chapters, Madison was a Federalist who changed and became an anti-Federalist over this institution, over the idea of a national bank. He was vehemently and constitutionally opposed to it. And now he's the president. So predictably, in 1811, neither the Republican Party nor Madison supported the idea of a bank. And this is a nice political idea, and certainly demonstrates that Madison was true to his principles. But this theory of weak government and non-national banks is going to make it incredibly difficult to put together the finances to conduct this war. And and sectional cooperation was not really there. So we essentially now have three regions in the country. We have New England, we have the South, and then we have this vast area known as the West, which is basically the Northwest Territories, between the Ohio and Mississippi and the Great Lakes and other areas of the Southwest, or what was then the Southwest. And New Englanders were vehemently against the war. They were against the embargo. They were against the Intercourse Act. They were against Macon's Bill No. 2. They were against everything that the Republicans had done. The war declaration was uniformly renounced and denounced by the Federalists, who are almost exclusively from New York and New England. So, because of Jefferson and Madison's policies of weak central governments, this war was going to have to be fought, at least in the early goings, based on state militias and state banks. Well, some of the strongest banks in the United States were in New York and New England, none of which are going to cooperate with the desire of the federal government to get its hands on capital. And this is a disaster. As far as the militias go, New England militias and the New York militia will vow to never march outside of their state. They are going to take an exclusively defensive posture, meaning if Britain comes into their state to fight, they'll fight back. But once they have been repelled out of that state, that militia's done its job and they are going home. And this is a disaster. So what ends up happening is, in this early shot, there's really more fury than fire from the Americans. And this is going to spell a disaster. If I just go back there, you can see, right, this map. What happens is that the Americans, for the most part, are going to put most of their effort at defending our borders against British incursions and putting down Indian rebellions in support of the British. And then what happens is Napoleon is defeated first in Russia, and then he's going to be followed all the way back to Paris. And he's going to step down and be sent into exile in Elba. And this allows the British to sort of double its efforts. And they decide to shift some resources to the United States. And instead of sending those resources north to do that, they took advantage of very disorganized militia in the Chesapeake region, and really all over the country for that matter, and decided to do an assault in the Chesapeake. And so we get the burning of Washington, D.C., which is depicted in this painting. So the vengeful British decide to march on Washington, D.C., and finding it virtually undefended, decide to set the whole place on fire, which was not uncommon for the British. This was something that they would do quite regularly. But they made it a point to, in a sense, celebrate the desecration of the American Capitol. And President Madison had fled to try to get the militia organized to resist the British. They had dropped off troops in Washington, D.C., and then they were sailing up to Fort McHenry, where they were going to drop off more troops and basically capture the entire area and essentially game over. And so Madison gone to out to join the militias to see if he couldn't get them connected up with American regular forces in order to resist the British. His wife Dolly, however, was left behind, and she emerges as somewhat of a hero. In many ways, Dolly Madison sort of defines what it means to be a first lady. She was quite a socialite, but more importantly, a rather committed patriot, just like Martha Washington. And she had actually been the acting first lady under Jefferson because he was a widower. And so the story goes that the executive mansion had to be evacuated at the very last minute, and Dolly Madison was considered a hero because she stayed behind long enough to gather up some of the more meaningful relics, if you will, out of the White House, including a Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington. And so, according to the legend, the British take over the executive mansion in time to eat the dinner that was that had been prepared for the president and the first lady, and made a toast to Madison and some other type of foolery. I don't know, but anyhow, what happens, of course, is the Battle of Lake Champlain was a major success for Americans because we were able to stop the British from going any further and reversed the flow of the war. For us, however, the big thing is going to be in Fort McHenry. So, just really quickly, the Fort McHenry is in what's today Inner Harbor, Baltimore, and the British thought that if they captured that fort, they could land troops there, and then troops from Baltimore and Washington would just simply march toward each other, capturing the American army and its militia in basically classic pincer movement. So this becomes part of the big legend, if you will, for the United States. And this is the Battle of Fort McHenry in 1814. And Francis Scott Key was actually in the harbor on a British ship. He had gone there to negotiate a ransom for one of his friends who had been taken prisoner. And he was on board when the fighting started. Now, as was typical of the period, navies would bombard forts. And if the forts decided to surrender, they would do something called strike the colors, which means they would lower their flag and put up a white flag. And this is how we get our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, from this idea of Francis Scott Key wakes up the next morning and he sees the American flag still flying, which we call Old Glory, and is absolutely thrilled that his country did not in fact surrender, but in fact withstood the bombardment, and now it was the British who were going to be forced to move backward. And this is, part of our folklore. So if you ever listen to the Star-Spangled Banner again, pay attention to the words and you'll get the connection. The White House is going to get its name from the War of 1812 because Madison, wanting the Capitol to look as nice as possible, ordered it to be whitewashed to hide the scars and char marks from the British invasion, which at the time meant that there was just this enormous white mansion sticking out in the middle of the place, which prompted people to call it the White House. And to this day, on what's now referred to as the Truman Balcony, there's a section of the exterior wall that is left preserved with plexiglass so that you can see the char marks and cannonball marks on the building from that battle. So the British are now left with a dilemma. What happens, of course, is that Napoleon escapes exile and is reviving his war. England had to make a choice. Do you worry about Napoleon, or do you worry about a weak, faraway country that probably doesn't matter all that much in the long run? And they essentially decide that they're going to just, give it up. And we get what's called the Treaty of Ghent. This is John Quincy Adams primarily, along with Henry Clay and I'm blanking out now who the other person was. But they negotiate this treaty. It's on Christmas Eve, December 24th. And it outlines basically what we refer to as status quo antebellum. So that just means that they were going to go back to the way things existed prior to the war, which means the same boundaries, the same fishing rights, the same troop deployments. But the British were going to evacuate the Northwest Territories. So after this war, however, the U.S. and British relations improved. There's going to be a treaty in the new administration under James Monroe called the Treaty of Rush-Bagot. And this is going to demilitarize the Great Lakes and create what is still referred to as the largest unfortified border in the world between the United States and Canada. Now, this did not end the fighting. That's because technology at the time did not allow for various people to find out exactly what the hell was going on. And so we get what is, essentially the only unmitigated disaster for the British, and really the only verifiable and legitimate victory of the Americans in the entire war, and that's the Battle of New Orleans. And Jackson was prepared to defend the valuable port and successfully defeated the British, although outnumbered 2-1. And so it's a very unnecessary war because it happens a couple weeks, or I should say a week and a half after the treaty is signed. But Andrew Jackson himself is going to emerge as a major hero of this war, as did William Henry Harrison and many others. But in the midst of this, the Federalists, who had resisted and resented the war from the beginning, had convened in Hartford, Connecticut. And there they had put together a list of demands. They wanted what we would refer to today as supermajority votes, a 2/3 vote, in order for the Congress to pass embargoes or to declare war or to admit new states. And this was an interesting list of demands coming from Federalists. Federalists, as you know, had a philosophy of a strong central government and weaker states. And here, the Federalists were basically asking for a very anti-Federalist thing to weaken the ability of the central government to do things by requiring 2/3 majority votes. And in the Senate, this was going to be particularly difficult. So the question becomes, was that a conspiracy? And, historians go back and forth on this issue about what was the true intent of this convention. But what is pretty clear is that they were going to make these demands on the federal government, and they were going to insist that these changes be made through amending the Constitution, or they were going to reconvene to discuss, in fact, whether they should break off and form their own country, what we would today call secession. And what happens, of course, is that news of the Hartford Convention breaks out in the papers at the same time that the news of the Treaty of Ghent and the victory at New Orleans starts to circulate. So for the average American, whether it was intended as a conspiracy, is seen as such and as an act of treason. And it really does spell the result that the Federalists are going to suffer huge electoral punishment. And by 1816, they are essentially no longer a national party. So the aftermath of this war is been really the final establishment, if you will, of America as a truly independent and sovereign nation. And so the British are going to make a decision, in my opinion, that better to have America as a sort of co-opted partner and to essentially pacify the North Atlantic, rather than constantly be fighting these little nitpicky wars between the two countries that aren't really resolving anything and are in fact very expensive and disruptive. And so this is the beginning, really, of the new Anglo-American alliance that will culminate during the World Wars in the 1900s. Internally, this is really a birth of new nationalism in the United States. Americans are going to put Francis Scott Key's poem to song. They are going to, start to praise American works of art and American literature and American scholarship. There's all these sort of, let's just call them births of new pride in the United States. And we'll see in the next unit how that translates into a very aggressive political agenda on the part of one group of politicians led by Henry Clay, and really spell the beginnings of a split between the two parts of the country now, North and South. And so as you see the other resources that are here, I'd just like to remind you that we will be going into one more chapter in this unit regarding the economic and the economic and cultural developments of the United States at the time period of 1800 to 1815. And I should also note that this is, for many people, the end of the so-called critical period, where the United States finally demonstrated that it was in fact a legitimate sovereign power able to exercise its own authority and to establish its own sovereignty over its own territory. So until we meet again, hopefully everybody's doing well, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.